Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Mindset Shift. The goal is still the same. We want to start thought-provoking conversations to make sure that our mindset is transformed and that we contribute positively to the society, to make sure that all that we envision can be achieved and it can be seen. Today, we've got a very interesting subject. The subject that we have today is a subject that so many people are facing, the subject of storms. Many people within society today are facing storms. Storms are coming in different particular ways. They're affecting people in different ways. And the extent of the effect of these storms is slowly but surely degenerating our society. But the most important question that we ought to answer is not about the storm specifically, but what is the price that we ought to pay to calm the storm? Knowing that it is inevitable for us as human beings to face storms. What is it that we ought to do? What is it that we ought to maximize? And what is it that we ought to master to make sure that we will be able to calm these particular storms? Now, storms, they come in different ways. Abuse is a storm. Rejection is a storm. Loss is a storm. Death is a storm. So many things associated with size of affecting an individual can be titled as a storm. But the important thing in understanding a storm is that all the elements that make up a storm are elements that are able to be affected by human beings. Even a physical storm, you will understand that there is a lot of wind, there is a lot of water. So a storm is simply particular elements that have taken their extreme potential. And the extreme potential of existing elements is what causes a storm that can particularly affect an individual. It is therefore important to understand that when you respond to a storm, you cannot respond to a storm to whose elements you don't understand. Because understanding the elements that bring together a storm is what will make you be able to walk in paying a price to calm the storm. See, storms are not calmed because of tears. Neither are storms calmed because of time. So many people always say time will heal. But with many people that are still within the position of the effect of a storm, they will tell you that time itself does not heal the storm. But what you do within the particular time that you're facing is what you will be doing to pay the price to make sure that you calm the storm. So today we want to talk about the price that one ought to pay for them to calm the storm. If you do not pay this price, just like what you see in a retail shop, that what you don't purchase, you cannot get. If you don't pay the price, you will simply not get the result. There are so many people that after facing storms, they were degenerated. They died within their storms. Could it be that storms were made to make sure that people die useless? That is not the case. But storms were introduced and storms come to make sure they provoke an individual into responding to that particular storm, but by paying the price. It's only when you pay the price of the storm that you do get a result that is going to benefit you. So there is something very interesting that happens when Jesus is within a boat with his disciples. There was a very robust storm that was there. This storm was very big. This storm was going to affect their lives. So the storm was causing an uncomfortable nature within the particular boat. But we've got two groups of people. We've got entities that are within the boat that are all trying to respond to the storm, but they get different results. So firstly, the disciples, when the storm arises, the first thing that they thought of is the size of the storm. Henceforth, they looked at the effect that it could have on their lives. Now, this is the response that the disciples decided to take when the storm arose. But in the same boat, we've got Jesus, who in the midst of the storm is lying down and he is silent. I need you to understand that we have the same entities existing in the same location, facing the challenges of the same storm. But we will see that their response to the storm is what makes them different. So what makes people different is not the size of the storm, but it is the response within that particular storm. So our response is going to determine the response that we will even have within the storm. So the disciples, having looked at that particular storm, what they do is that they fear for their lives. The introduction of fear was as a result of their understanding of the storm. So the disciples were well aware that that particular storm could have an effect on them as entities, which could further take their lives. This we know very well because some of them were fishermen before. So they understand even what could have happened to previous fishermen when such a storm would arise. I would assume that Peter was one of the leading disciples in being afraid of what was to come because of his understanding of what a storm brings. But in that particular boat, the Bible reveals to us how there was now water that had gone within the boat. And yet Jesus was lying down within a boat that had water that had entered, and also a boat that was moving in a very fearless direction. So we have Jesus that is in the same boat, that is got almost a higher effect because we are told he was lying down. The disciples were standing. But Jesus was still able to be still at that particular present moment. Looking at this situation, I understood what Jesus managed to do in response with the storm. Now, Jesus did not directly respond to the storm that had come to the boat. But what Jesus managed to do was he managed to respond to an uncomfortable position that he was in. The uncomfortable position Jesus was in is that there was water that was in the boat, and he was lying down at a place that was not stable. But within that instability and the water that was slowly getting to him, Jesus managed to be still in the uncomfortable nature that existed in the storm. So here we have Jesus not responding to the storm, but he is responding to the uncomfortable nature that is currently existent within the boat that he is in. What Jesus managed to do when he was responding to the uncomfortable nature of where he was lying and water that was slowly getting within was he managed to be still. And the stillness that he was showing within that particular uncomfortable environment brought what was called peace. Now, the state in which Jesus was now in was he was still and he was calm and he was peaceful. And what this managed to do is it managed to build what we call capacity. So when there's an uncomfortable situation that is introduced in the midst of a storm, your response to the uncomfortable position builds what we call capacity for you to have enough impact to respond to the storm. So Jesus, having taken the stillness and the peace in the uncomfortable situation of where he was lying, he was able to rise on the capacity of stillness and peace so as for him to command the same stillness and the same peace to the storm. So Jesus only managed to respond and calm the storm because of the state that he was in, because of how he responded to an uncomfortable position. Yet we have the disciples that had already eroded the possibility of calming the storm because they responded to the storm the way the storm had come to affect them. You cannot respond to a storm in fear when the storm has come to provoke that fear in you. Because the moment the storm is able to steal your peace and your capacity building, the storm has defeated you already. The essence of a storm is not merely to kill you, but the essence of a storm is supposed to derail you over understanding your identity and your capacity in what you are meant to achieve. So the moment in which fear is introduced when the storm arises, then already the storm has managed to do what it is supposed to do. So many of us, after the storm arises, we may think if we do not die, then the storm did not take over from us. These are the kinds of people that say time will heal you. Where you think because you've forgotten of what the storm did at that present time, but you have ignored what the storm introduced in your mind, such as fear, you think that the storm did not complete its purpose, yet its initial purpose was to derail you from your identity and derail you from the potential and the capacity you could have had in response to that particular storm. To make this simple, I was actually driving and there was a very funny thing that appeared to me of a man who is a husband and the wife. So we have a husband that has a problem that he is small in stature.
he does not have enough strength. He does not have enough power. And we have his wife, his woman, that has grown in stature to a point that this man can no longer physically carry his wife. The storm to this man is that he is unable to carry his wife. If he tries to respond to this storm by trying to carry the woman by force, it is impossible because the size of the woman and the strength that this man has are mutually exclusive. They are not existent together. So in response to this storm, the man does not try to lie himself into carrying the woman that he cannot physically carry. But an uncomfortable position has to be introduced in his lifestyle where this man goes to the gym. What the gym does is, whilst he's at the gym, going to the gym is uncomfortable in the midst of the storm. Going to the gym is not something that you would have wanted to do in response to the storm. But what it does is it builds capacity for more strength. And if this man can consistently go to the gym for the next 6 months, what he is building whilst he is at the gym is what we call capacity. Now, the capacity increases the strength that the man can have. And when the man has started consistently building capacity for 6 months, he gains the strength where he can now go to his wife and carry her. So in response to the storm, this man did not feel discouraged on who he was, considering the state of the storm. But what the man did was he mastered the art of being still and making sure he responds to the uncomfortable position to build capacity to respond to the storm. So this is exactly what we ought to do as a society. As a society, we have focused too much on the sizes of the storm that it has actually discouraged us from doing smaller things that could build capacity in response to that particular storm. We've got a storm even of how the economy is at this particular time, where so many people can complain that we do not have jobs, where so many people can complain that we do not have opportunities. What facing this storm has done is it has discouraged especially the young people to a point that they now feel like they don't have a hand to play in calming the storm, because the storm has introduced fear, a fear in letting them know that they're going to live mediocre lives because of the state of the economy. But what that has done is, instead of pushing the young people into understanding a role they ought to play by addressing the current uncomfortable position, is this storm has driven the young people into places of substance abuse, into places where they are continuously derailing their identity because of the size of the storm. And what the storm would have done is it would have removed the potential that the nation could have in transforming that particular nation. Instead, what we ought to do is have discussions around what is the price that we can play right now in terms of addressing uncomfortable position the young people should take now in response to what the storm had already said. That's why you will see that it is very uncomfortable to start a business. That's why you will see that it is very uncomfortable for you to build value in you right now. Yet all those uncomfortable positions are the only things that can build capacity in response to the storm. So the storms that we are facing today require us to turn them down into smaller uncomfortable positions that we can respond to. And as we build stillness and as we build peace within the uncomfortable positions, we are able to have an answer to the storm that we are facing. There is a young man who I had a chance to have a discussion with. And we were talking about a very great man that had fallen and that had crumbled. His wealth was gone, his family was gone. He had faced a serious amount of loss. What I intended to know is what was the resultant response to that which had happened. And the man does say that for the first particular years, he tried to respond to how much he had lost, to respond directly to the storm. But because of the environment and the surroundings that were existent, he failed to respond to that particular storm. In response to the storm, he was trying to revitalize a life that he once lived. But he ignored essentials that he was not doing along the way. The essentials were things that were very important, but that would restore the wealth that was lost. One of the things that this man said he had failed to do was to adjust his lifestyle. He was unable to adjust to an uncomfortable position at that particular time so as to respond to the size of that particular storm. It was essential for this man who had lost a lot to be able to adjust his lifestyle to suit what he was now currently going through, so as for him to build from scratch and revitalize his understanding of how he had built the wealth in the first place. So he does say that for years he had failed to do this until he managed to adjust his lifestyle and begin to where it all started. And what that did is it restored capacity in him so as for him to rebuild his wealth. So it is important that when we do face storms, when we do face rejection, when we do face heartbreak, when we do face loss, when we do face death, that we don't look at the storm, look at its size and be discouraged into doing things that will help us. But it is us accepting that the storm has arrived, but being able to respond to the smaller essentials of uncomfortable positions that we ought to take. And as we do that, we build capacity so that we go far. So business people will explain this to say everybody starts small. What is small is not the vision, but what is small is the initial uncomfortable positions that you ought to respond to. It is the initial positions such as when you have not made it, you need to walk, though your vision is to be making sure that you drive to work. When you have not made it, you need to be able to be sent around by those that have gone there so that for you to build the capacity and the understanding of how to get there. Poverty is a storm. Poverty is something that scares many people. But your response to poverty is not addressing the size of poverty. Is not addressing you not eating for days because of what poverty has brought. But it is you understanding that poverty will be solved by you creating value in you, that you are able to attract the wealth that poverty cannot attract. It is you taking the uncomfortable positions now of building capacity, of building wealth, of building value in yourself that is now able to build you into addressing the storm, which is poverty. So every single time when you try to directly address a storm that you have not built capacity for yet, it is always going to derail your identity. It is always going to derail your understanding. It is always going to discourage you in your ability to respond to that particular storm. We spoke about it in some of the previous episodes, where we said that every time when you are responding even to a national problem, try to understand how to respond to the local problem that you have capacity for. But whilst you are there, continuously build capacity for yourself to be able to then respond to the national problem. Because if you try to address the problem at its height, you will not understand that some of these storms come there to build capacity in you. When we look at the lifestyle of Joseph, we are going to see that the storms that arose upon his life were coming to reveal the capacity that could be built in him, so as for him to have the strength, the capacity, the knowledge, and the wisdom to be able to stand as a leader for a nation. If you fail to address the smaller, uncomfortable positions that you ought to respond to, you will never have a response to that particular storm. So Jesus, after responding to his current uncomfortable position, Jesus, after facing the waters that had spilled into the boat, whilst the disciples were moving around in fear, just like so many people in society today, Jesus then arises at the point of stillness, at the point of peace, and at the point of power. And what he says is he calms the storm. The storm responded immediately. because of the position of capacity that Jesus was in, that the disciples were not in themselves. The Bible even continuously makes it clear to us that and the disciples were now feared more, because they said, what kind and what manner of man is this that even nature responds to him? When you build capacity for your storm, nothing will not respond to your effort, will not respond to your state. Because the world is built in a way that everything that was created responds to the power and capacity of whatever would have been created to. Businesses do not respond in how genuine you are in your pursuit for money, but businesses respond in how genuine you are in your pursuit for building capacity. Relationships respond to how genuine one is in building capacity. Every single storm that you can think of requires you to build capacity. It is very unfortunate that one has to go through these storms. It is very unfortunate that one has to undergo the pain. But the fortunate matter is there is a way out that was given to everyone, regardless of the storm that you are facing. But the way out is only in you building capacity in stillness, in peace, so as to have the power to address the storm directly. Even today in the world, we have politicians that are able to distinguish us as citizens in our abilities to respond to the problems we are facing in the nation. Because problems and storms are highlighted to be so big to a point that we are discouraged in the position we can play in response to these storms. But as these problems are highlighted, the conversations we ought to be having in society is if there are economic problems, if there are social problems, if there are problems of inadequacy, how can we begin to build capacity in such natures? How can we begin to build value in such cases so that we become the generation that can grow in capacity so as to be able to have response within the storm when the storm arises? This is very essential. Have an understanding of what your storm is. Have an understanding of the elements that bring the storm together. But most importantly, ask yourself what you ought to do today, what you ought to do in addressing your character, what you ought to do in addressing your position in society, what you ought to do to address the value that you need to create, what you ought to do to address the trail of pain that was left by the storm. And within doing that, you continuously build capacity so that as you rise to the response of the storm will respond exactly as to how and what you've gone through. It is very unfortunate that you're going through what you're going through, but it is very fortunate that there is a response and there is an answer that you can give. The response and the answer is uncomfortable, but what it does is it builds capacity to transform your life. It builds capacity for you to have a story, and it builds capacity to calm that storm. Pay the price today. Pay the price tomorrow. Pay the price next week. Continuously do that. And when capacity has been built, you will understand that you would have managed to respond to the particular storm. Thank you so much for your time. Continuously start the conversation. Continuously ask questions. We are trying by all means to respond to all topics that you believe are essential, that you believe need to be discussed, and that you believe can be mind-provoking and can transform our generation. Until we meet again in the next episode.